The wedding dress was still hanging in the bridal suite when the event manager walked in and quietly said, "I'm so sorry, Emily, but your wedding has been cancelled." And for a second I thought she had the wrong bride, the wrong room, the wrong life, because 30 minutes earlier I had been standing in front of a mirror adjusting a $12 hairpin I bought myself, telling my reflection that everything was finally coming together, that despite everything my parents had said, despite every time they chose my sister over me, this one day was mine. But then I saw the look on her face, the kind that doesn't leave room for misunderstanding, and I felt something shift in my chest, not panic, not even anger, just this cold, quiet recognition that somehow they had done it again. They had found a way to take something that was supposed to belong to me and give it to her instead. And I remember asking very calmly, "What do you mean cancelled?" Like if I kept my voice steady enough, the answer might change, but it didn't. She glanced down at her clipboard and said, "We were notified this morning that the payment was withdrawn and redirected." And that word, redirected, landed harder than anything else because I already knew exactly where it had gone. I didn't need her to say my sister's name, I didn't need confirmation, I could picture it clearly, the floral arrangements, the live band, the oceanfront venue in Santa Barbara that my parents had proudly paid for just 3 weeks. Earlier, $185,000 for Sophia's dream wedding, every detail perfect, every guest impressed, every photo curated like a magazine spread, and mine, a modest ceremony I had spent a year planning down to the smallest detail, had just been erased with a single transaction. And the worst part wasn't even the cancellation, it was the silence, the way no one from my family had called me, no warning, no explanation, just this quiet removal, like I didn't deserve to be told, like I wasn't important enough to include in the decision about my own life. And as I stood there in that room, still in my robe, hair half done, I could hear guests starting to arrive downstairs, voices echoing through the hallway, laughter, confusion, someone asking where they should go, and I realized they were all about to find out before I even had the chance to process it myself, and for a moment I considered walking out there smiling, pretending everything was fine, because that's what I had always done, that's what this family had trained me to do, minimize, accept, move on. But something stopped me, something that had been building for years, every ignored birthday, every comparison, every time I was told I wasn't the right investment. It all came rushing back at once, and I thought about the last thing my father said to me just a month ago when I asked carefully if they could help cover a portion of the venue deposit. He didn't even hesitate, he just leaned back in his chair and said, "Emily, we have to be realistic about where our money makes the most impact." And I nodded like I understood, like I agreed, like it didn't cut straight through me. But standing there now, watching my wedding disappear in real time, I finally understood exactly what he meant. And I also realized something else, something I didn't fully grasp in that moment but would change everything just weeks later, because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the money they had just redirected wasn't entirely theirs to control. And 3 weeks later, in a courtroom filled with strangers and a silence that felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced, a judge would say something that would force everyone in my family to finally see me, really see me, for the first time in their lives. I did not cry when she left the room. Not when I heard the door click softly behind her, not even when my phone started vibrating nonstop with messages from guests asking where to go, what was happening, if there had been some kind of delay, because I had spent my entire life learning how to stay quiet when something inside me broke, and this felt exactly like that, familiar in a way that made it almost easier to stand still and breathe through it. And for a moment I just sat down in that chair, in front of the mirror, still half dressed, staring at my own reflection like I was looking at someone else entirely. Someone who should have expected this, because this was not the first time my parents had decided that my life was optional while my sister's was essential. It was just the first time they had done it in front of over 100 people who were about to witness it in real time. And that was when my phone lit up again. But this time it was not a guest, it was my mother. And I knew before answering that whatever she was about to say would not be an apology, it never was. So I picked up anyway and said, "Hi, Mom." Like nothing had happened, like I was still their reasonable, understanding daughter. And she did not even ask how I was, she did not ask where I was, she went straight to logistics, her voice calm and almost rehearsed. "Emily, I was going to call you, there has been a change of plans." And I remember closing my eyes because that phrase, change of plans, had been the soundtrack of my childhood. Birthdays moved because Sophia had something more important, vacations adjusted around her schedule, even college visits rearranged so she could attend events that benefited her. And now apparently my wedding fell into that same category, and I asked her, "Did you cancel my wedding?" And there was a pause, just a second, just enough for me to hear the truth before she dressed it up, We redirected the funds, yes, she said, like she was talking about a minor budget decision, like this was a spreadsheet and not my life. And I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. To Sophia? And she let out a small sigh, the kind that always meant I was being difficult. Emily, your sister's event needed additional support. These things happen and we assumed you would understand. And that word assumed settled over everything because it meant they never even considered asking me. They had already decided that my role was to accept, to adjust, to disappear if necessary. And I almost laughed because it was so predictable, so perfectly aligned with every other moment I had tried to matter in this family. And for a second I thought about arguing, about raising my voice, about finally saying all the things I had held back for years, but instead I asked one question, the only one that actually mattered. The money you used, where exactly did it come from? And she hesitated again, longer this time, and I could hear something shift on the other end of the line, like she was choosing her words carefully now. It was family money, Emily. It is not something you need to worry about. And that was when something clicked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet realization sliding into place, because I knew that account, I knew the structure of it, I knew the name attached to it because I had seen the documents once years ago, when my grandmother had called me into her study and told me something that did not make sense at the time but suddenly felt very relevant. And I remember gripping the edge of that vanity table as I said, I think I do need to worry about it. And she went silent, completely silent, which was rare for her, and that silence told me more than anything else could have, because for the first time there was uncertainty in her response, and I realized they had not just taken something from me again, they had taken something they might not have had the right to take at all, and I did not fully understand the implications yet. I did not know how it would unfold or how far it would go. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity as I sat there in that empty bridal suite, listening to the distant confusion of guests who had come to celebrate a wedding that no longer existed. This was not going to end the way it always had before, because this time I was not going to quietly step aside, and what they did not realize, what none of them realized in that moment, was that their decision to cancel my wedding had just set something in motion that they would not be able to control. I did not go downstairs to face the guests, not yet, because something more important had just taken hold of my attention, something that felt bigger than the humiliation waiting outside that room. And as soon as I ended the call with my mother, I reached for my phone again, not to answer messages, not to explain anything, but to search for a name I had not thought about in years, the name my grandmother had told me to remember. And as it appeared on the screen, I felt that same quiet certainty building again, the kind that does not come from hope but from recognition. Because suddenly pieces that never made sense before were starting to align in a way that felt almost deliberate, and I remembered that afternoon 5 years ago, sitting in my grandmother's study surrounded by shelves of old leather-bound books and the faint scent of lavender, when she had looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before and said, Emily, there are some things in this family that are not what they seem. And at the time I thought she was just being cryptic, maybe even a little dramatic, because that was how she spoke sometimes. But then she had opened a folder carefully, like it contained something fragile, and showed me a document that I barely understood, something about a trust, about allocation, about future beneficiaries, and I remember asking her why she was showing me this, why me and not my parents or Sophia, and she had smiled in that quiet way she always did and said, because you are the only one who listens. And I did not fully understand what she meant then, but I do now, because as I stared at my phone in that bridal suite, I realized that the account my parents had just redirected was not simply family money the way my mother claimed. It was tied to that document, to that trust, to something that had been set in place long before any of this happened, and more importantly, something that might legally belong to me, not them. And that was when the anger finally surfaced, not loud, not explosive, but controlled and focused in a way that felt unfamiliar and strangely steady, because this was no longer about favoritism or hurt feelings or being overlooked. This was about something concrete, something measurable, something that could be proven. And for the first time in my life, I was not standing on emotional ground that could be dismissed or minimized. I was standing on something that might actually hold. And I remember taking a deep breath, looking at myself one more time in that mirror, still half-dressed, still not a bride anymore, and saying quietly, okay, like I was accepting a challenge rather than a loss. And then I picked up my bag, slipped my phone inside, and walked out of that room without looking back, past the hallway where guests were starting to gather in confusion, past the front desk where the staff avoided my eyes because they did not know what to say, and out into the parking lot where the afternoon sun felt almost too bright for what had just happened. And as I got into my car, I did something I had never done before. I did not call my parents, I did not call my sister, I did not try to fix anything or smooth anything over. Instead, I dialed the number my grandmother had given me all those years ago, And when a calm, professional voice answered on the other end, I said, "My name is Emily Carter, and I think there has been a mistake with a family trust." And there was a pause, a brief one, before the man on the line responded, "Miss Carter, I have been expecting your call." And in that moment, sitting alone in a parking lot in a dress I no longer had a reason to wear, I realized that whatever my parents thought they had control over, whatever decisions they believed were final, were about to be questioned in a way they never saw coming, because what they did not know, what they could not have known, was that my grandmother had already prepared for something like this long before any of us ever imagined it would happen. I did not go home after that call. I drove straight to the address the man gave me, a quiet office building on the edge of downtown Boston where everything looked deliberately understated. No flashy signs, no marble lobby, just a small brass plaque by the door that read Harper & Cole Legal Trust Services, and I remember sitting in my car for a full minute before going in, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, still wearing a dress that no longer had a purpose, trying to process how a day that was supposed to be the beginning of my marriage had turned into something else entirely, something heavier, something that felt like it had been waiting for years to happen. And when I finally stepped inside, the receptionist looked up at me with a brief flicker of surprise before composing herself and saying, "Miss Carter, he is expecting you." Like this meeting had been scheduled long before I even knew I would need it, and that alone made my pulse quicken because it confirmed what I was starting to suspect, that my grandmother had not just warned me, she had planned for this. And when I walked into the office, the man who stood to greet me looked exactly how I imagined, late 60s, composed, observant, the kind of person who did not waste words, and he gestured for me to sit before saying, "Emily, I am very sorry about today." And I froze for a second because I had not told him anything about what had just happened, not yet, and he seemed to notice that reaction because he added calmly, "Your grandmother kept me informed of certain possibilities." And that sentence landed with a weight I could not ignore, because it meant this was never random. This was never just about my parents being unfair. This was something deeper, something structural, and I took a breath and said, "They took money from an account they said was family money, but I think it is not." And he nodded slowly, like he had been waiting for me to reach that conclusion on my own. Then he turned to a file on his desk and opened it with deliberate care, revealing documents that looked almost identical to the ones I had seen years ago in my grandmother's study. And as he slid one page toward me, I felt my hands tense slightly, because I already knew what I was about to read, but seeing it in front of me made it real in a way memory never could. And there it was, in clear, precise language, a trust established by my grandmother detailing allocations, protections, and most importantly, a clause that specified control and access. And when I reached the section that listed beneficiaries, I felt my breath catch just slightly because my name was there. Not shared, not conditional, but clearly designated. And I looked up at him and said, "This account, the one they used, it is tied to this, is it not?" And he gave a small nod before answering, "Yes, Emily, the funds your parents redirected are part of this trust." And I felt a quiet confirmation settle over me, not satisfaction, not yet, but clarity, because everything that had felt emotional and dismissible before was now anchored in something factual, something that could not be explained away with words like assumption or practicality. And I asked the question that mattered most, the one that would determine everything moving forward. Did they have the right to use it? And for the first time since I walked in, his expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice the seriousness behind it as he said, "Based on the structure your grandmother put in place, no, they did not." And the room went completely still after that, not because of the volume of his voice, but because of what those words meant, because in that moment what my parents had done was no longer just unfair, it was something else entirely, something that carried consequences far beyond a cancelled wedding. And I remember sitting back in that chair, letting that realization settle fully, because this was the point where everything changed, not externally yet, not publicly, but internally, because for the first time in my life I was not the one trying to prove my worth to them. They were the ones who had to answer for something they should never have done. And as I looked down at the document again, tracing the line where my name was written with a clarity that could not be denied, I understood something I had missed for years. My grandmother had not just believed in me, she had protected me in a way that only made sense now at the exact moment I needed it most. And what I did not realize then, not fully, was how far that protection extended, or how quickly it would escalate once it was put into motion. I did not respond immediately after he said those words. I just sat there staring at the document in front of me, letting the weight of it settle slowly instead of rushing past it the way I had done with everything else in my life, because this was different. This was not something I could minimize or rationalize away. This was clear, structured, written in language that did not leave room for interpretation. And for the first time I was not the one being dismissed, I was the one being validated by something that carried authority beyond opinion or family hierarchy. And I remember asking quietly, what happens now? Because even though I understood what they had done was wrong, I did not yet understand what that meant in terms of action. And he closed the file carefully before leaning back in his chair and saying, that depends on what you want to do, Emily. And that question caught me off guard more than anything else that had been said so far, because my entire life had been shaped around reacting to decisions other people made for me, adjusting, accommodating, accepting, and now suddenly I was being asked to decide, to choose what direction this would take. And for a moment I did not answer because I realized I had never really been given that kind of control before, not in a way that mattered. And he continued, his voice calm but precise. You have the right to challenge the use of those funds, to request a full accounting, and if necessary to pursue legal action to recover what was taken. And the phrase recover what was taken echoed in my mind because it reframed everything. It was no longer about losing something, it was about something being taken from me, something that could potentially be returned. And I thought about my parents, about how easily they had made that decision, how casually my mother had said the words redirected the funds, as if it was a minor adjustment instead of a complete erasure of something that mattered to me. And I asked, if I do this, what does that look like? And he did not hesitate. It means documentation, formal notice, and likely a court proceeding. And there it was, the part that made this real in a way that went beyond understanding, because this would not stay contained within the quiet boundaries of family disagreement. This would become public, structured, visible in a way that could not be undone once it started. And for a brief second I felt that familiar hesitation, the instinct to avoid conflict, to keep things contained, to protect whatever fragile version of family still existed. But then I remembered standing in that bridal suite, hearing my wedding had been cancelled without a single conversation, without even the courtesy of being informed beforehand, and that hesitation faded just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something steadier, something more deliberate. And I said, I want to know everything, every transaction, every decision tied to that account. And he nodded once, like that was exactly the answer he expected, before reaching for another folder and sliding it across the desk toward me. Then we start here, he said, and as I opened it, I saw a timeline, dates, amounts, transfers that stretched further back than I anticipated. And what stood out immediately was not just the most recent withdrawal that had affected my wedding, but a pattern, smaller amounts over time, subtle enough to go unnoticed if no one was looking closely. And I felt a shift in my understanding again, deeper this time, because this was not a single decision made under pressure. This was something that had been happening for a while, something intentional, something calculated. And I asked, they have been using it before this? And he answered simply, yes. And that single word carried more weight than anything else in that moment, because it meant this was not just about me anymore. It was about a system they had been operating under the assumption that no one would question it, that no one would ever challenge them. And I sat there for a long second, looking at those numbers, those dates, those quiet records of choices that had been made without my knowledge, and I realized something I had not fully grasped until now. This was not just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about exposing something they believed would never come to light. And as I closed the folder slowly, I felt that same calm certainty return, stronger this time, more defined, because I understood the path ahead was not simple, it would not be quick, and it would not be easy, but it was clear. And for the first time in my life, clarity felt more powerful than approval. And as I looked up at him again, I said, then we proceed. Without hesitation, without looking back, because what they had done had already crossed a line they could not uncross. And what they did not realize yet, what they would soon be forced to understand, was that this time, I was not going to step aside quietly and let it go. The first notice went out 48 hours later, formal, precise, and written in language that left no room for interpretation. And I remember staring at the email before sending it, my finger hovering over the screen longer than it should have. Not because I doubted the facts, not because I was unsure of what they had done, but because I knew the moment that message was delivered, there would be no returning to the version of my family that existed before, even if that version had always been fragile and uneven. And when I finally pressed send, I did not feel relief, I felt a shift, something quiet but irreversible, like stepping across a line that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice it. And less than an hour later my phone rang, my father's name appearing on the screen in a way that felt almost inevitable, and for a brief second I considered letting it go to voicemail, delaying the conversation. But I knew that would not change what was coming, so I answered. And the first thing he said was not a greeting, not even my name, it was, "What is this?" His voice controlled but edged with something sharper underneath, and I could picture him standing in his office, the printed notice in his hand, reading it over and over as if the meaning might change if he looked at it long enough, and I responded calmly, "It is a formal request for an accounting of the trust funds," and there was a pause, longer than I expected, followed by a short, dismissive laugh. That did not quite reach the tone he was aiming for. "Emily, you cannot be serious," he said, and I leaned back in my chair, steady, grounded in something that felt entirely different from any conversation we had ever had before. "I am," I answered, and the silence that followed carried more weight than anything he could have said, because it was the first time he did not immediately control the direction of the conversation, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not louder, but tighter. "This is family money, you have no standing to question it." And that was when I realized how deeply they had convinced themselves of that version of reality, how certain they were that I would never challenge them, that I would never look closely enough to understand what was actually happening, and I said, "That is not what the documents say." And I could hear the change instantly, the moment uncertainty replaced confidence, subtle but unmistakable, and he responded more slowly this time, "You are misunderstanding the structure." And I shook my head even though he could not see it. "No, I am not," I said, and for a second I thought he might argue further, might try to reassert control the way he always had, but instead there was another pause, followed by something I had never heard from him before, not quite hesitation but something close to it, and then he said, "You should drop this, Emily." Not as an order but as a warning, and that was when everything became completely clear. Because warnings only come when there is something to protect, and I felt that same steady calm settle over me again, stronger this time, more certain, and I answered, "I am not dropping it," without raising my voice, without adding anything else, because I did not need to, and he exhaled slowly on the other end, the sound controlled but carrying the weight of someone recalculating in real time, and then he said, "You are making a mistake." And I thought about that for a second, about all the times I had been told that before, every decision that did not align with what they wanted framed as a mistake, every attempt to define my own path dismissed as impractical or unnecessary, and I said, "We will see," before ending the call, and when the line went quiet I set my phone down and sat there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, because something had shifted again, not externally yet, not in a way the world could see, but internally in a way that felt permanent, because for the first time I was not reacting to their decisions, I was setting something in motion that they would have to respond to. And later that evening, as I reviewed the documents again, going over each transaction, each date, each transfer that had been quietly executed without my knowledge, I realized something else, something that had been there in the background but had not fully surfaced until now. This was not just about the money, it was about control, about who had the authority to decide what mattered and what did not. And for years that authority had never been mine, but now for the first time it was being questioned in a way that could not be ignored. And what I did not realize then, not completely, was how quickly that question would escalate once the formal process began, or how unprepared they would be when it reached a place they could no longer influence or contain. The next few days moved faster than I expected, not in a chaotic way, but in a structured, almost unsettling rhythm where everything was documented, time-stamped, and recorded with a level of precision I was not used to seeing in my own life. And I found myself adjusting to it quickly, reviewing emails, signing formal requests, reading through summaries of transactions that once would have felt overwhelming but now felt necessary. Like each detail was another piece of something I was finally seeing clearly, and what stood out most was not just the amount that had been taken for my sister's wedding, but how casually it fit into a larger pattern, small withdrawals over time, justified as expenses, adjustments, reallocations, all words that sounded harmless until you looked at them side by side and realized what they added up to. And every time I saw another entry, another date, another amount, I felt that same quiet confirmation settle deeper. Because this was no longer about interpretation, this was evidence, and evidence does not rely on emotion, it stands on its own. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, documents spread out in front of me, when my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my sister. And for a moment I just stared at her name on the screen, because she had not reached out since the day of my cancelled wedding, not a call, not a message, not even a simple acknowledgement. And now suddenly she was texting, and when I opened it, the message was short, almost casual. "Hey, can we talk?" And I felt a slight shift in my chest, not anticipation, not exactly anger, but something more controlled, something that understood this conversation was not about connection, it was about damage control. And I typed back, about what? Keeping it simple, and her response came quickly. Mom told me what you are doing, this is getting out of hand. And I read that twice, letting the words settle, because it was interesting how quickly the narrative had been reframed, how something that was documented and verifiable had become getting out of hand. And I replied, I am asking for an accounting of funds that were used without my authorization. And there was a pause before her next message, longer this time, and when it came it was different, less casual, more pointed. Emily, this is not worth ruining everything over. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable, because everything in our family had always meant something very specific. It meant the version of reality where she was prioritized and I adjusted, where decisions were made without me and I accepted them, where balance was maintained by my silence. And I typed back, everything was already ruined when my wedding was cancelled without a conversation. And this time the pause stretched longer, long enough that I set my phone down and went back to the documents in front of me, tracing the sequence of transactions again, noticing details I had missed before. And when my phone buzzed again, her tone had shifted once more, sharper now. You are overreacting, it was just money. And that sentence stayed with me for a second, because it revealed something deeper than she probably intended. The assumption that what mattered to me could be reduced to something insignificant, something replaceable. And I picked up my phone again and replied, it was not just money. And I left it at that, because I did not need to explain further, not to her, not anymore. And a few seconds later 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again, like she was trying to decide how to respond, and finally her message came through. If you take this to court, it is going to affect all of us. And there it was, the real concern, not fairness, not truth, but consequence. And I leaned back in my chair, reading that sentence again, because it confirmed something I had been realizing more clearly with each passing day. This was no longer about whether what they did was right or wrong. It was about what would happen when it was exposed in a space they could not control. And I set my phone down without responding this time, letting the silence sit, because not every statement required an answer. And as I looked back at the documents, at the pattern that had been quietly building for years, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not a misunderstanding, this was not a mistake, this was a system they had relied on, a system that assumed I would never challenge it, and for the first time that assumption was being tested in a way they could not easily dismiss. And what they did not realize yet was how far that test was about to go once it reached a point where their influence no longer mattered. By the end of that week, everything that had once felt contained within private conversations and quiet decisions had started to take on a more formal shape, one that followed a process neither my parents nor my sister could interrupt with a phone call or dismiss with a conversation at the dinner table. And I could feel the shift in the way they responded, not just in what they said, but in how they said it, because the confidence that had defined every interaction before was beginning to thin, replaced by something more cautious, more calculated. And I noticed it the first time my mother called again, not to explain, not to apologize, but to ask in a tone that was almost unfamiliar, Emily, what exactly are you trying to accomplish? And I stood by my kitchen counter, looking out the window as I considered that question, because for years the answer would have been simple approval, acknowledgement, a place in a family that always seemed to exist just out of reach. But now it was something else entirely, something that did not depend on how they saw me. And I said, I am trying to understand where the money went. Keeping my voice level, because I had learned that clarity did not require volume. And she exhaled slowly, the sound carrying a trace of impatience beneath it. We already told you it went to your sister's wedding. This does not need to become something bigger than it is. And I almost responded immediately, almost pointed out how it had already become something bigger the moment they made that decision without me. But instead I paused, because I realized this was not about convincing her, it was about allowing the process to speak for itself. And I said, it already is. And there was a silence that followed, heavier this time, more deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, softer on the surface but edged with something more direct underneath. You are putting us in a very difficult position. And I let that settle for a moment because it revealed more than she intended, the focus not on what was right or wrong, but on the discomfort of being questioned. And I replied, you put me in a difficult position when you canceled my wedding without telling me. And for a second there was no response at all, just the faint sound of her breathing on the other end of the line, and then she said, we thought you would understand. and that phrase, the same one she had used before, felt different now because I no longer heard it as an expectation. I heard it as an assumption that had been built over years. An assumption that I would always absorb the impact of their decisions without resistance, and I said, "That does not change what you did." And this time she did not try to reframe it, she did not offer another explanation, instead she shifted in a way that made her intentions clearer. "Emily, if this goes any further, it is going to affect more than just us. There are implications you are not considering." And I understood exactly what she meant. Not in terms of specifics, but in terms of strategy. This was no longer about minimizing the situation, it was about expanding the consequences in a way that might make me reconsider. And I felt that familiar pattern trying to reassert itself, the pressure to step back, to keep things contained, to protect a version of stability that had never really included me. But this time it did not take hold the way it used to. This time I recognized it for what it was, and I said, "Then we will deal with those implications when they come." And the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not uncertain, not hesitant, but controlled in a way that suggested she was reassessing the situation entirely. And when she finally spoke again, her tone was measured, almost neutral. "We will be speaking to our attorney." And I nodded even though she could not see it, because that was expected, inevitable even, and I said, "So will I." Before ending the call, and as I set my phone down, I felt that same steady clarity settle over me again, because everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, not smoothly, not easily, but in a way that was structured, undeniable, and beyond their ability to quietly manage behind closed doors. And later that night, as I reviewed another set of documents noting the consistency in the transactions, the way each decision had been layered over time, I realized something that had not fully surfaced until now. This was not just about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about establishing something that had never existed before in my relationship with them: accountability. And what they did not realize yet, what they were only beginning to sense, was that once accountability enters a system that has operated without it for years, everything within that system starts to change in ways that cannot be undone. The official response from their attorney arrived the following Monday morning, exactly 9 days after my wedding had been canceled, and I remember opening the email at my kitchen table with the same calm focus that had started to define everything I did lately, because by that point nothing about this process felt surprising anymore. It felt structured, almost inevitable, like each step was simply the next piece falling into place. And as I read through the document, I could immediately recognize the strategy behind it, the careful wording, the attempt to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a violation. Phrases like discretionary authority and familial intent repeated in different forms, all designed to suggest that what had happened fell within acceptable boundaries. And for a brief second I wondered if this was the version of reality they truly believed, or just the version they hoped would hold up under scrutiny. And I looked up from the screen when my phone buzzed again, this time a message from the attorney I had met with, asking me to come in that afternoon. And when I arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt different from the first time, more focused, more precise, as if the situation had officially moved beyond preparation into something more active. And he gestured for me to sit before saying, "We expected this." And I nodded because I had too, in a way, even if I had never been through something like this before. The pattern was clear enough now to anticipate their next move, and he placed their response on the desk between us, tapping lightly on one section. "They are claiming broad discretion over the funds, but that does not align with the structure your grandmother established." And I leaned forward slightly, reading the highlighted portion again, noticing how it avoided direct references to the specific clauses that defined access and control, and I asked, "So what happens next?" And he did not hesitate. "We proceed to formal filing." And those words carried a different kind of weight than anything that had come before, because this was the point, where everything moved beyond negotiation, beyond private exchanges, into a system that operated independently of personal influence. And I felt a brief moment of stillness as that realization settled, not fear, not hesitation, just awareness, because this would not be contained anymore. It would become part of a record, something visible, something structured, something that could not be undone once it began. And I nodded slowly, "Okay." And he gave a small, approving nod in return before outlining the next steps, timelines, filings, the expected response, all of it delivered in a steady, measured tone that made everything feel both complex and manageable at the same time. And as I listened, I realized something I had not fully considered before. This process was not just about proving what had already happened, it was about establishing a record that would define what could happen next, And later that evening when I returned home, my phone was already filled with messages, not just from my parents or my sister this time, but from extended family members I had not heard from in months, even years, and I did not need to read them to understand what they would say. I could already imagine the tone, concerned, cautious, urging me to reconsider, to keep things private, to avoid making something public that could damage the family. And I opened one message at random, from an aunt who had always kept her distance but never hesitated to offer opinions, and as expected, it began with, "Emily, I heard what is happening," followed by a series of statements about unity, about perspective, about not letting things escalate unnecessarily. And I read through it once before setting my phone down without responding, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. These messages were not about understanding the situation, they were about preserving a version of it that felt more comfortable to everyone involved, a version where nothing fundamentally changed, where the system remained intact. And I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle, because it clarified something important. This was not just a disagreement between me and my parents. It was a challenge to something larger, something that had been accepted without question for years. And as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the city lights just beginning to come on outside my window, I felt that same steady certainty return, stronger now, more defined, because I knew exactly what I was doing and why, and what they did not realize yet, what they were only beginning to feel through second-hand messages and carefully worded responses, was that this was not going to stop at conversation or compromise. It was moving toward a point where everything would have to be addressed directly, in a place where explanations would not be enough and assumptions would not hold. The filing was submitted 2 days later, and I remember the exact time because I checked it twice before closing the confirmation window, 3:42 p.m., a small detail that somehow made everything feel more real, more permanent, like a timestamp marking the moment this shifted from preparation into something that could not be reversed. And for a few seconds after it was done, I just sat there staring at the screen, not expecting anything to happen immediately, but still feeling like something had changed. In a way that was difficult to explain, because even though nothing around me looked different, the quiet of my apartment, the same light coming through the window, the same stack of documents on the table, everything felt more defined, more structured, as if the uncertainty that had surrounded this situation was finally narrowing into something concrete. And it did not take long for the reaction to begin, not publicly, not in a dramatic way, but in the same pattern I had come to recognize over the past week: messages first, then calls, then silence, and the first call came from my father again later that evening, his name appearing on my phone in a way that felt almost expected now, and when I answered, his voice was different from before, not controlled in the same confident way, but measured, deliberate, like he was choosing each word more carefully. "You actually filed," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that still carried disbelief underneath it, and I replied, "Yes," without adding anything else, because there was nothing left to explain at that point, and there was a pause, longer this time, followed by a quiet exhale that sounded less like frustration and more like recalculation, and then he said, "You have no idea what this is going to do." And I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that sentence settle, because I had heard variations of it before, warnings framed as concern, consequences presented as reasons to step back. But this time it felt different, not because the words had changed, but because I had, and I said, "I think I do." And for a moment there was no response, just the faint sound of him breathing on the other end of the line. And then he spoke again, more directly now. "This is not just about money, Emily, this affects the entire family." And I almost responded immediately, almost pointed out that it had always affected the entire family, just not in a way that anyone acknowledged, but instead I paused because I realized something important. This conversation was no longer about reaching understanding, it was about maintaining positions, and I said, "It already has." And that was when his tone shifted again. Sharper this time, less measured. "You are forcing this into a place it does not belong." And I felt that same steady calm return, the kind that had started to replace the instinct to defend or explain, and I answered, "No, I am taking it to the place where it does belong." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything else in the conversation, because it was not filled with uncertainty or hesitation, it was filled with the recognition that this was no longer something he could redirect or control. And after a few seconds he said, "You are making a mistake." The same phrase he had used before, but it carried less weight now, less authority, and I realized that for the first time, those words did not land the way they used to. They did not create doubt or hesitation. They simply existed as part of a pattern I had already moved beyond, and I replied, "We will see," before ending the call, and when the line went quiet, I placed my phone on the table and looked down at the confirmation email still open on my laptop, the official record of what had just been set in motion, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment, not just the canceled wedding, not just the conversation with my mother or the documents I had reviewed, but years of smaller moments that had built up quietly, each one reinforcing the same message about where I stood in this family, and I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not a sudden reaction, this was the result of a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long, and as I closed the laptop and stood up, moving through the apartment with a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar but steady, I understood that whatever happened next would not unfold the way it had in the past, because this time, the outcome would not be determined by who spoke the loudest or who held the most influence within the family. It would be determined somewhere else entirely, in a space where facts mattered more than assumptions and where decisions carried weight beyond personal preference. And what they did not realize yet, what they would soon have to face, was that once something enters that space, it does not bend to expectation or history, it follows its own path, one that cannot be easily redirected once it begins. The notice for the court date arrived faster than I expected, printed on standard white paper but carrying a weight that felt far heavier than anything I had held in my hands before, and I remember reading the date twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because seeing it written so plainly made everything feel immediate in a way it had not before, and for a moment I just sat there at my kitchen table, the document resting in front of me, realizing that this was no longer something that existed in emails or conversations or quiet meetings in an office. This was now scheduled, structured, and moving forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. And as I set the paper down, I felt a brief flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel up to that point, not doubt exactly, but awareness of the scale of what was about to happen, because this would not be contained, this would not be private, this would take place in a setting where everything would be examined, questioned, and recorded. And for a second I wondered what it would feel like to sit across from my parents in that environment, not as their daughter, not as someone expected to accept their decisions, but as someone challenging them in a space that did not recognize family hierarchy, and that thought lingered just long enough for me to notice it before it settled into something steadier, because whatever discomfort came with that moment, it would not be greater than what had already happened. And I reached for my phone, not to call them, not to explain anything, but to confirm the details with the attorney, who answered with the same calm precision he had maintained throughout this entire process, walking me through what to expect, the timeline, the structure of the hearing, the way evidence would be presented and questioned. And as I listened, I realized something that had not fully registered before. This was not about telling my story the way I had experienced it. This was about presenting facts in a way that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. And that distinction mattered because it meant everything I had felt, every moment of being overlooked or minimized, would not be the focus. What would matter were the documents, the transactions, the structure of the trust itself. And I nodded as he spoke, even though he could not see me, because that clarity made everything feel more grounded, more manageable. And when the call ended, I looked around my apartment, at the same space that had become both my refuge and my workspace over the past few weeks, and I noticed how different it felt now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had. And later that evening my phone buzzed again, this time not with a call or a message, but with a notification from an unknown number, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but something made me open it anyway, and the message was short, direct, and unmistakably intentional. Emily, we need to resolve this before it goes any further. And I did not need a name attached to it to know who it was from, and I stared at the words for a second, noticing the shift in language from warnings to urgency, from dismissal to negotiation, and I set the phone down without responding immediately, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Timing mattered, not just what was said, but when it was said, and this message was not coming from a place of reflection or accountability, it was coming from a place of reaction to the court date, to the process becoming real in a way they could no longer ignore. And I picked up the phone again, reading the message one more time before typing a response. You had the opportunity to resolve this before my wedding was canceled. And I paused for a second, considering whether to add anything else, whether to explain or soften the statement in any way. But I did not, because there was nothing to add that would change the meaning of what had already happened. And I pressed send, placing the phone back on the table as a quiet stillness settled over the room. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think about what it would feel like when this reached its conclusion, not in terms of outcome, not in terms of winning or losing, but in terms of finality, because whatever happened next, whatever was decided in that courtroom, it would mark the end of something that had been in place for years, a system, an understanding, a pattern that had defined my role in this family. And as I sat there in the quiet, the city lights reflecting faintly against the window, I realized something with a clarity that felt both simple and significant. This was no longer about changing their perception of me, it was about stepping into a position where their perception no longer determined my reality, and what they did not fully understand yet, what they were only beginning to confront through messages and attempts to negotiate, was that once that shift happens, once someone moves out of a role they have been placed in for years, there is no returning to it, no matter how much anyone might want things to go back to the way they were. The morning of the hearing arrived with a kind of quiet that felt almost intentional, like the world had decided to lower its volume just enough for me to notice every detail more clearly. And I remember standing in front of my closet longer than I needed to, not because I did not know what to wear, but because I understood that this was not just another day, this was a moment that would define everything that came after. And I chose something simple, structured, neutral, nothing that drew attention but nothing that diminished me either, because for the first time I was not trying to fit into a role they had assigned me, I was stepping into one I had chosen myself. And as I drove to the courthouse, the city felt different, not unfamiliar but sharper somehow, every light, every turn, every passing building registering in a way it usually did not. And when I parked and walked toward the entrance, I felt that same steady calm settle in, the kind that had replaced hesitation over the past few weeks. Not because I was unaffected by what was happening, but because I understood it now, fully, and inside the courtroom was quieter than I expected, smaller too. Not the dramatic space people imagine, but something more contained, more deliberate, where every word carried weight simply because of where it was being spoken. And when I stepped inside, I saw them immediately, my parents seated together, my sister beside them, their presence familiar in a way that would have once shifted something inside me. But now it did not in the same way, because I was no longer looking at them from the same position I had always occupied. And for a brief moment our eyes met, my mother's expression tight, controlled, my father's unreadable, my sister's somewhere between frustration and something I could not quite define, and I looked away not out of discomfort, but because I did not need that connection to steady myself anymore. And when I took my seat beside my attorney, placing my hands lightly on the table in front of me, I felt something settle into place, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally in a way that felt final, because this was it. This was the point where everything moved from what had happened to what would be decided, and as the proceedings began, the structure of it all became immediately clear: statements, responses, references to documents that I now knew almost by memory. And as each point was presented, I watched the way the language shifted, how what had once been framed as assumption and practicality was now being examined in terms of authorization and control. And I noticed something else too, something subtle but undeniable, the way my parents' confidence, the certainty that had defined every interaction with me for years, was no longer present in the same way, replaced by something more cautious, more measured. And when the trust document was brought forward, when the specific clauses were read aloud, outlining access, allocation, and limitation in language that did not leave room for reinterpretation, I felt that same quiet confirmation return, because this was not about proving something new, it was about placing what already existed into a context where it could not be ignored. And for a moment as I listened, I thought back to the day my wedding had been cancelled, the way everything had felt sudden and final, the assumption that there was nothing I could do to change it, and I realized how far that moment had carried me, not just into this room, but into a position I had never occupied before. And as the arguments continued, as each side presented their perspective within the structure of the law, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost unexpected. This was not about confrontation anymore, it was about resolution, about bringing something that had been hidden into a place where it could be fully seen. And what I did not yet know, what none of us knew in that moment, was exactly how that resolution would take shape. But I knew it was coming because everything had led here in a way that felt too precise to be accidental. And as the judge reviewed the documents, his expression steady, focused, I felt a stillness settle over the room, not tense, not uncertain, but anticipatory in a way that made every second feel longer. And I realized this was the moment everything had been building toward. The point where what had been argued, explained, and examined would finally be addressed directly, in a way that would not rely on interpretation or assumption, but on something far more definitive. The room went completely still when the judge finally looked up from the documents, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet authority that made every small movement feel significant. And I remember the way his eyes moved briefly across the room, not lingering on anyone in particular but acknowledging the presence of everyone involved, before settling back on the file in front of him as if confirming something one last time. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and clear in a way that did not need volume to carry weight, based on the structure of this trust and the documentation provided. He began, and I felt my hands remain steady on the table in front of me, even as every part of my attention focused on what came next, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, not just the past few weeks, but years of quiet assumptions and unchallenged decisions that had led us here. And he continued, the funds in question were not subject to discretionary use by the respondents. And those words settled into the room with a kind of finality that was impossible to ignore, because they did not just address what had happened, they defined it clearly, precisely, in a way that could not be reinterpreted or softened, and for a brief second I allowed myself to register the impact of that, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally in a way that felt both grounding and surreal at the same time, because something that had been dismissed, minimized, and reframed so many times was now being acknowledged exactly for what it was. And the judge continued, referencing specific clauses, outlining the limitations that had been placed on the account, the conditions under which funds could be accessed, each point reinforcing the same conclusion in language that did not rely on emotion or perception. And as he spoke, I glanced briefly across the room, not out of habit but out of awareness, and I saw the shift in my parents' expressions, the controlled composure that had defined them, earlier now replaced by something more rigid, more contained, as if they were holding on to a version of certainty that no longer aligned with what was being said. And my sister sat beside them, her posture still, her gaze fixed forward, not meeting mine, and I realized in that moment that this was not just about a decision, it was about the unraveling of something they had relied on for years without question. And when the judge reached the final part of his statement, his tone did not change, but the words carried a different kind of weight. The court finds that the funds were used without proper authorization and must be restored accordingly. And there it was, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive in a way that left no space for negotiation or reinterpretation. And I felt something settle inside me, not triumph, not relief exactly, but clarity, because this was not about winning. It was about something being set right in a way that could not be undone or ignored. And as the proceedings moved toward their conclusion, as final instructions were given and next steps outlined, I remained still, listening, absorbing, understanding that this moment marked the end of something that had defined my role in this family for as long as I could remember. And when it was over, when the room began to shift again, people standing, papers being gathered, quiet conversations starting in low voices, I stayed seated for a second longer, letting the stillness linger just a little before standing, because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before. This was not just about what had been taken or what was being returned, it was about the fact that the system itself had been challenged and in this instance had been required to answer. And as I walked out of that courtroom, past the same hallway I had entered earlier that morning, the same doors, the same quiet surroundings, everything felt different, not because the world had changed but because I had, and I did not look back, not at my parents, not at my sister, not at the space we had just occupied together under entirely different terms than we ever had before, because there was nothing behind me that needed revisiting. And as I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air cooler than it had been that morning, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost simple after everything that had happened. I had spent years trying to fit into a place that was never designed for me to stand in fully, and now, without forcing anything, without asking for permission, I had stepped out of it entirely. And what they did not understand, what they might never fully understand, was that the most significant part of what happened in that courtroom was not just the decision that was made, it was the shift it created, because once something like that is acknowledged, once it is defined in a way that cannot be dismissed, it changes everything that comes after, whether anyone is ready for that change or not.